The Dawn Flows Home to the Sea, Part 2, by Mikhail Sholokhov, continued.
Is there any news of your Stepan? He sent me his greetings recently. Is he fit and well? It seems so.
Aksenia shrugged her shoulders. Again, she could not be false to herself or dissemble her feelings. Her unconcern for the fate of her husband was so obvious that Natalia involuntarily smiled.
I can see you don't worry very much about him, but that's your business. This is what I've come for. The silly story is going round the village that Gregor's making up to you again, and that you see him when he comes home. Is it true?
You've come to the right person to ask, Aksenia said in a jeering tone. Suppose I ask you whether it's true.
Are you afraid to tell the truth? No, I'm not. Then tell me, so that I know and don't go on tormenting myself. Why should I get upset over nothing?
Aksenia narrowed her eyes, then raised her brows.
In any case, you won't get any pity from me, she said sharply. It's like this between you and me. When I'm miserable, you're glad, and when you're miserable, I'm glad, for we share the same man, don't we? Well, I'll tell you the truth, so that you may know in good time. It's all true. They're not talking nonsense. I've won Gregor again, and this time I shall do my best not to let him slip out of my hands. And now what are you going to do? Smash the windows of my hut, or stab me with a knife?
Natalia tied the flexible switch in her hand into a knot, threw it towards the stove, and answered with an unnatural firmness, I shall do no wrong to you now. I shall wait until Gregor comes back and have a talk with him, and then we shall see what I'm going to do about the pair of you. I've got 2 children, and I shall know how to stand up for them and for myself, too. Aksenia smiled and answered, So for the present I can live without fear of anything? Ignoring the sneer, Natalia went up to Aksenia and touched her by the sleeve. Aksenia, all my life you've stood in my way, but now I shall not plead as I did once before, you remember? Then I was younger, stupider. I thought, I'll plead with her and she'll have pity. She'll soften her heart and give Gregor up. I shan't this time. One thing I know, you don't love him. You only hanker after him out of habit. Did you ever love him as I do? I doubt it. You played about with Listnitsky, and whom haven't you played about with, you wanton? When a woman loves a man, she doesn't do that. Aksenia turned pale. Pushing Natalia away, she rose from the chest. He never reproached me with that, but you do. And what business is it of yours? All right, I'm bad and you're good. What then? That's all. Don't be angry. I'm going now. Thank you for telling me the truth. Don't bother to thank me. You'd have found out without my help. Wait a bit, I'll come out with you and close the shutters. In the porch, Aksenia halted and said, I'm glad we part in peace, without a fight. But I tell you, dear neighbor, that so far as the future is concerned, it's going to be like this. If you've got the strength, take him. But if you haven't, don't be offended. I shan't willingly give him up any more than you will. I'm not so young now, and though you called me a wanton, I'm not your Darya. In all my life I have never played about where such things are concerned. You have got children, but all the same to me, he's... Aksenia's voice quivered and went huskier and deeper. He's all I care for in all the whole world. He's my first and my last. But let's not talk about him any more. If he comes through alive, if the Queen of Heaven saves him from death and he comes back, then he'll choose for himself. That night Natalia could not sleep. Next morning she went with Ilinichna to weed the melons. She found things easier to bear when she was working. Her mind was not so occupied with the one thought as she steadily brought the hoe down to the clods of sandy, sun-dried, crumbling clay. Occasionally she straightened her back to rest, to wipe the sweat from her face and to take a drink. White clouds, tousled and torn by the wind, were floating and melting across the blue sky. The rays of sunlight scorched the red-hot earth. Rain was approaching from the east. Without raising her head, Natalia could feel when a flying cloud covered the sun. She felt a momentary coolness on her back. A gray shadow impetuously hurried over the brown, hot earth, over the tangle of watermelon tendrils. It covered the melons scattered over the slope, the grasses limp and flattened with the heat, the bushes of hawthorn and bramble with their dismal-looking foliage sprinkled with bird droppings. The yearning cry of the quails grew louder. The pleasant song of the skylarks came more distinctly to the ear, and even the wind, stirring the warm grasses, seemed less sultry. But then the sun pierced the dazzling white selvage of the cloud as it floated westward, and, freeing itself from its net, once more threw slanting, sparkling, golden torrents of light down to the earth. Somewhere, a long way off, over the azure spurs of the Dawnside hills, the shadow advancing with the cloud was still rummaging over and speckling the ground. But the amber-yellow noontide was again reigning in the melon patches. The fluid haze quivered and danced on the horizon. The earth and its grasses smelled still more parched. At noon, Natalia went to a spring in the cliff and brought back a pitcher of icy water. She and Ilinichna drank their fill, washed their hands, and sat in the sunlight to eat their dinner. Ilinichna spread out a kerchief and neatly cut up bread on it. She took spoons and a cup out of the wallet and drew a narrow-necked ewer of sour milk from under her jacket, where she had hidden it away from the sun. Natalia ate poorly, and her mother-in-law asked, "I've noticed for some time that you've changed somehow. Has anything gone wrong between you and Grisha?" Natalia's weathered lips quivered miserably. "He's going with Aksenia again, Mother." "What? How do you know?" "I went to see her yesterday." "And did she admit it, the hussy?" "Yes." Ilinichna was silent, thinking. Her lined face set sternly. The corners of her lips drew down grimly. "Maybe she's only bragging, curse her." "No, Mother, it's true. Why should she?" "You haven't kept your eye on him," the old woman said tentatively. "You mustn't take your eyes off that sort of husband." "But how can anyone keep her eyes on him? I relied on his conscience. Had I got to tie him to my apron strings?" Natalia smiled bitterly, and added almost inaudibly, "He's not Mishatka to be kept in check like a child. He's gone gray quite a lot, but he doesn't forget the past." Ilinichna washed and wiped the spoons, rinsed out the cup, collected the utensils in the bag, and only then asked, "Is that all the trouble?" "You are strange, Mother. That one trouble's enough to make life miserable." "And what are you thinking of doing?" "What is there I can do? I'll take the children and go to my own people. I shan't live with him any longer. Let him take her into his home and live with her. I've been tortured enough already." "I thought like that, too, when I was young," Ilinichna said with a sigh. "My man was a dog, too, there's no gainsaying it. I couldn't tell you all I suffered through him. Only it isn't easy to leave your own husband. And besides, what's the use of it? You think it out a bit more, and you'll see that for yourself. And how can you take the children away from their father? No, you're talking nonsense. You're not even to think of it. I shan't allow it." "Well, Mother, I shan't live with him, so don't waste your breath." "What do you mean by don't waste your breath?" Ilinichna took offense at the remark. "Aren't you my daughter, then, or what? Am I sorry for the accursed pair of you or not? And you can say such things to me, to your mother, to an old woman. I've told you to put it right out of your head, and that's enough. Pah! You think I'll leave home. But where will you go? Who of your own people wants you? You've got no father, your house is burned down, your own mother is glad to Christ to live in someone else's hut, and yet you're going off to her and drag my grandchildren with you? No, my dear, that won't do. We'll see what to do with Grishka when he comes back. But now you're not even to talk to me about it. I won't have it, and I don't want to hear another word about it." All the pain that had been accumulating for so long in Natalia's heart suddenly broke out in a convulsive fit of sobbing. With a groan, she tore the kerchief from her head, fell face downward on the dry, ungracious earth, and, pressing her breast to the ground, sobbed on and on without ceasing. Ilinichna, wise and brave old woman, did not even stir from where she was sitting. After a while she carefully wrapped the ewer with the rest of the milk in it in the jacket, laid it aside in a cool spot, then poured water into the cup and sat down beside Natalia. She knew that words were of no help in such sorrow. She knew, too, that tears were better than dry eyes and firmly pressed lips. She let Natalia weep till she could weep no more, then laid her work-worn hand on her daughter-in-law's head. Stroking the black, lustrous hair, she said harshly, "Well, that's enough. Don't use up all your tears. Leave some for another time. Here, take a drink of water." Natalia quieted down. Her shoulders still heaved occasionally, and a fine trembling possessed her body. Unexpectedly she jumped up, pushed Ilinichna aside, and turning her face eastward, putting her tear-stained palms together in prayer, hurriedly, sobbingly screamed, "Lord, he's tortured my soul to death. I haven't the strength to go on living like this. Lord, punish him, curse him, strike him dead. May he live no longer. Torture me no longer." A black rolling cloud crawled onward from the east. Thunder rumbled hollowly. Piercing the precipitous cloudy masses, a burning white lightning writhed and slipped over the sky. The wind bent the murmuring grass westward, sent a pungent dust flying up from the track, bowed the sunflower caps with their burden of seeds almost to the ground. It tousled Natalia's disheveled hair, dried her wet face, wound the edge of her gray workaday skirt around her legs. Ilinichna stood for several seconds, staring at her daughter-in-law in superstitious horror. Against the background of the black thundercloud which had climbed to the zenith, Natalia seemed a strange and terrible creature. The rain came upon them impetuously. The calm before the thunderstorm lasted only a moment. Dropping obliquely, a sparrowhawk began to cry anxiously. A marmot whistled a last time close to its burrow. The violent wind threw a fine sandy dust into Ilinichna's face and went howling over the steppe. The old woman struggled to her feet. Her face was deathly pale as, through the roar of the approaching storm, she shouted, "What are you saying? God help you! Whose death are you calling for?" "Lord, punish him! Punish him, Lord!" Natalia screamed, fixing her frenzied eyes on the majestically and wildly gathering clouds, piled into masses by the wind, lit up by blinding flashes of lightning. The thunder broke with a dry crash over the steppe. Beside herself with fear, Ilinichna crossed herself, went with uncertain steps to Natalia, and seized her shoulder. "Go down on your knees! Do you hear, Natalia?" Natalia looked at her mother-in-law with unseeing eyes, and helplessly sank to her knees. "Ask God for his forgiveness," Ilinichna authoritatively ordered. "Ask him not to accept your prayer. Whose death are you asking for? The father of your own children. Oh, it's a mortal sin. Cross yourself. Bow yourself down to the ground. Say, 'Lord, forgive me my wickedness, sinful that I am.'" Natalia crossed herself, whispered something with white lips, and clenching her teeth awkwardly fell over on her side. Washed by the downpour, the steppe turned astonishingly green. A brilliant arching rainbow was flung from the distant pond right to the dawn. The thunder was still rumbling hollowly in the west. Muddy hill water was pouring and gurgling along the runnel. Foaming rills streamed down to the dawn over the slope, over the melon plots, carrying with them leaves torn away by the rain, grass washed by its roots out of the soil, broken ears of rye. Oily, sandy alluvium crawled over the melon plots, piling against the melon and watermelon tendrils. Along the summer tracks flowed the rejoicing water, washing out deep ruts. A stack of hay, set on fire by lightning, was burning out on a spur of a distant ravine. The lilac column of smoke rose high, almost touching the crest of the rainbow arching over the sky. setting their bare feet cautiously on the dirty, slippery road, lifting high their skirts, Ilinichna and Natalia made their way down to the village. As they went, Ilinichna said, "You're terribly touchy, you youngsters, God's truth. The least thing, and you go into a frenzy. If you'd lived as I had to live when I was young, then what would you have done? All his life, Grisha hasn't raised a finger against you, and still you're not satisfied. But you must go and carry on like that. You were all ready to throw him over, and you go off into a fit, and I don't know what you didn't do. You even brought God into your dirty business. Well, tell me, my sick child, is that good? But when I was young, my game-legged idol used to thrash me almost to death, and that all for nothing, all over nothing. I hadn't done the least thing to deserve it. He himself behaved abominably, but he worked his temper off on me. He used to come home at dawn, and I would scream and cry bitterly, fling reproaches at him, and he would give his fist its sweet will. For a month I'd go about as blue as iron all over, and yet I lived through it and brought up the children, and not once did I try to clear out. I'm not going to crack up Grishka, but you can at least live with a man like that. If it hadn't been for that snake, he'd have been the foremost Cossack in the village. She's bewitched him, no less." Natalia walked along for some time, silently turning over something in her mind, then said, "I don't want to talk about it any more, Mother. When Gregor comes back, then we'll see what I'm to do. Maybe I'll clear out of my own choice, or maybe he'll turn me out. But for the present I shan't leave your house to go anywhere else." "Now, you should have said that long ago," Ilinichna rejoiced. "God grant everything will work out for the best. He wouldn't turn you out for anything, and you're not to think of it. He loves both you and the children so much. Do you think he'd ever hear of it? Never. He won't forsake you for Aksinia. He can't do that. And there are quarrels even in the best of families, so long as he comes back alive." "I don't want him to die. I said that in my temper. Don't throw that up in my face. I can't turn him out of my heart, but all the same, life is heavy enough." "My dear, my own one, don't you think I know? Only you never ought to do anything in a rush. Let's drop all the talk about it, and for God's sake don't say anything to the old man about it. It's nothing to do with him." "There's one thing I must tell you. It isn't clear at the moment whether I shall live with Gregor or not, but I don't want to have any more children by him. Even with the two I've got, it's not certain where I may have to go. But I'm already carrying another, Mother." "Since when?" "I'm in my 3rd month." "But how can you get away from that? You've got to bear the child whether you want to or not." "I won't," Natalia said resolutely. "I'm going this very day to see old Mother Kapitonovna. She'll rid me of it. She's done it for other women." "What? You'll kill the seed? And you can talk like that, you shameless hussy?" The indignant Ilinichna halted in the middle of the road and clapped her hands. She was about to say something more, but behind them there was a rattle of wheels, the sucking noise of horse hooves in the mud, and someone's shout to his horse. Ilinichna and Natalia stepped off the road, letting their tucked-up skirts down as they went. Old Besklyabnov was driving back from the fields, and as he drew level with them, he reined in his spirited little mare. "Climb in, women, and I'll take you home. You don't want to need the mud for nothing." "Thank you, Agievich. We're tired out with slipping about," Ilinichna said contentedly. She was the first to seat herself in the capacious wagon. After dinner, Ilinichna wanted to have a talk with Natalia, to explain to her that there was no reason why she should free herself of her pregnancy. As she washed up the dishes, she mentally ran over the arguments which seemed to her to carry the most conviction, and even thought of telling Panteleimon of Natalia's decision, and calling in his aid to dissuade their grief-crazed daughter-in-law from her unwise step. But while she was dealing with domestic matters, Natalia quietly got herself ready and left the house. "Where's Natalia?" Ilinichna asked Dunya a little later.
She collected a bundle and went out. Where to? What did she say? What sort of bundle? Why, how should I know, Mother? She put a clean skirt and something else into a kerchief and went out without saying a word. Unhappy child! To Dunya's amazement, Ilinichna helplessly burst into tears and sat down on the bench. What's the matter, Mother? God help you, what are you crying for? Mind your own business, you impudence. It's nothing to do with you. But what did she say? And why didn't you tell me when she was getting ready? In a vexed tone, Dunya answered, You're really quite impossible. Why, how was I to know I'd got to tell you? She hasn't gone for good, has she? She must have gone off to see her mother, and what you're crying for I haven't the least idea. Ilinichna waited with the greatest anxiety for Natalia's return. Fearing her husband's reproaches and censure, she decided to say nothing to him about it. At sunset the herd returned from the steppe. The short summer gloaming descended. Rare lights were lit in the village, but Natalia was still missing. The Myelyakov family sat down to supper. Pale with agitation, Ilinichna served up the homemade vermicelli, with its garnishing of onion fried in vegetable oil. The old man picked up his spoon, crushed crumbs of stale bread in it, poured them into his bearded mouth, and abstractedly looking around at the others seated at the table, asked, Where's Natalia? Why don't you call her to the table? She's out, Ilinichna replied in a low tone. Out where? She must have gone to see her mother and decided to stay. She's staying a long time. She's old enough to know better, Panteleimon muttered discontentedly. As always, he ate diligently, zealously. Occasionally he laid his spoon down bottom upward on the table, took a sidelong, approving glance at Mishatka, who was sitting beside him, and said roughly, Turn round a bit, my boy. Let me wipe your lips. Your mother's a wanton, and there's no one to look after you. He wiped his grandson's tender, rosy little lips with his large, black, horny palm. They ate their meal in silence and rose from the table. Panteleimon gave the order, Put out the light. We haven't got much oil, and there's no point in wasting it. Shall I bolt the door? Ilinichna asked. Yes, but how about Natalia? If she turns up, she'll knock. Maybe she'll go roaming till morning. She's gone in for the fashion, too, now. You shouldn't let her talk so much, you old hag. A fine idea, taking it into her head to go visiting at night. I'll tell her so in the morning. She's following Darya's example. Ilinichna lay down without undressing. For half an hour she lay sighing, silently turning over. She was about to get up and go to see Kapitonovna when she heard uncertain, shuffling steps under the window. She jumped up with an agility not common to one of her years, hurriedly ran out onto the porch and opened the door. Natalia, as pale as death, clutching at the handrail, slowly came up the steps. The full moon brilliantly lit up her sunken face, her hollow eyes, her painfully knitted brows. As she walked, she swayed like a seriously wounded animal, and wherever she set her feet, she left a dark blood stain. Ilinichna silently put her arms around her and led her into the porch. Natalia leaned her back against the door and hoarsely whispered, Is everyone asleep? Mother, wipe up the blood behind me. Look, I've left traces. What have you done to yourself? Ilinichna half exclaimed, choking back her sobs. Natalia tried to smile, but a miserable grimace distorted her face. Don't shout, Mother, or you'll wake the others up. Well, I've rid myself. Now I've got a quiet heart. Only there's a lot of blood. It's pouring out of me as if I was a slaughtered animal. Give me your hand, Mother. My head's swimming. Ilinichna bolted the door. Then, as though she were in a strange house, she rummaged a long time with a trembling hand, and could not find the handle to the inner door in the darkness. Walking on tiptoe, she led Natalia into the large best room. She woke up Dunya and sent her out, called Darya, and lit the lamp. The door leading to the kitchen was open, and through it came Panteleimon's measured, mighty snore. Little Polyushka was sweetly smacking her lips and muttering something in her sleep.
Deep is a child's untroubled, restful sleep. While Ilinichna was puffing up the pillow and getting the bed ready, Natalia sat down on a bench and weakly laid her head on the edge of the table. Dunya wanted to come into the room, but Ilinichna harshly told her, "Go away, you shameless hussy, and don't show yourself here. It's nothing for you to poke your nose into." Scowling, Daria took a wet rag and went into the porch. Natalia painfully raised her head and said, "Take the clean bedding off the bed. Spread a piece of sacking for me. I'm sure to soil it." "Hold your tongue," Ilinichna ordered. "Undress and lie down. Do you feel bad? Shall I bring you some water?" "I'm feeling terribly weak. Bring me a clean shift and water." With an effort, Natalia rose and went with uncertain steps to the bed.
Only then did Ilinichna notice that her skirt was soaked with blood and hanging heavily around her, clinging to her legs. She stared with horror as Natalia bent down and wrung out the edge of the skirt as though she had been out in the rain, then began to undress. "But you're bleeding to death!" Ilinichna exclaimed. Natalia undressed and closed her eyes, breathing spasmodically and quickly. The old woman took one glance at her and then, with a resolute air, marched into the kitchen. After a struggle, she managed to arouse Panteleimon and said, "Natalia's ill. She's very bad. She may be dying. Harness up horses at once and drive to Vyshchenska for the doctor." "A devilish fine thing. What's happened to her? What's she ill with? She'd do better not to go roving at night." The old woman briefly explained what had happened. Panteleimon jumped out of bed in a frenzy and, buttoning up his trousers as he went, strode towards the best room. "Ah, you filthy bitch! Ah, you daughter of a bitch! What have you been up to, eh? Necessity forced her to it. Well, I'll teach her." "Are you mad? Damn you, where are you going? Don't go in there. She doesn't want you. You'll wake the children up. Go out to the yard and harness the horses quickly." Ilinichna tried to stop the old man, but paying no attention to her, he went to the door of the best room and kicked it open. "You've done a fine thing, you daughter of the devil!" he roared, halting on the threshold. "You mustn't, father. Don't come in. For Christ's sake, don't come in!" Natalia screamed piercingly. She had taken off her shift, and she pressed it to her breast. Swearing violently, Panteleimon looked for his coat, his cap, the harness. He was so long over it that Dunya could not control herself. She burst into the kitchen and fell on her father, while the tears started to her eyes. "Drive off at once! What are you rummaging about like a beetle in dung for? Natalia's dying, and he takes a whole hour to get ready, and he calls himself a father. If you don't want to go, why don't you say so? I'll harness up the horse myself and drive to Vyshchenska." "You're daft. What have you snapped your chain for? Who's going to take orders from you, you sticky scab? Here's another of them shouting at her father, the filth!" Panteleimon threw his coat edges together defiantly, and muttering curses under his breath went out into the yard. After his departure, everybody in the house felt less constrained. Daria washed the floor, ruthlessly shifting chairs and benches. Ilinichna allowed Dunya into the best room, and the girl sat at Natalia's head, smoothing the pillow, giving her water. Ilinichna occasionally stole in to the children sleeping in the side room. Then, returning to the best room, she gazed at Natalia, resting her cheek on her palm, shaking her head bitterly. Natalia lay silent. Her head, with its tangled skeins of dank, sweat-soaked hair, rolled about the pillow. Every half hour Ilinichna gently lifted her, drew away the saturated bedding, and spread clean linen. With every hour Natalia grew weaker. Sometime after midnight she opened her eyes and asked, "Will it begin to get light soon?" "No sign as yet," the old woman soothed her, thinking to herself, "That means she isn't going to come through. She's afraid of going without seeing the children." As though to confirm her guess, Natalia quietly asked, "Mother, wake up Mishatka and Polyushka." "What for, my dear? What do you want to disturb them in the middle of the night for? They'll be terrified if they see you, and they'll start crying. Why wake them up?" "I'd like to see them. I'm feeling bad." "God have mercy, what are you saying? In a minute Father will be bringing the doctor, and he'll help you. You ought to try to get some sleep, my dear, don't you think?" "What sleep can I get?" Natalia answered with a hint of annoyance in her tone. After that she said no more for some time, and her breathing grew more regular. Ilinichna quietly stole out onto the steps and gave way to her tears. She returned with a red and swollen face to the room when the dawn was beginning to show a faint glimmer in the east. As the door creaked, Natalia opened her eyes and asked again, "Will it be getting light soon?" "It's dawning now." "Cover my feet with a sheepskin." Dunya threw a sheepskin over her feet and tucked in the warm blanket at the sides. Natalia thanked her with a look, then called Ilinichna closer and said, "Sit down by me, Mother. And you, Dunya and Darya, go out for a while. I want to talk to Mother alone." "Have they gone?" she asked without opening her eyes. "Yes." "Father hasn't come back yet?" "He'll be back soon. Are you feeling worse then?" "No, it doesn't matter. This is what I wanted to say. Mother, I'm going to die soon. I can feel it in my heart. I've lost so much blood, it's terrible. Tell Darya, when she lights the stove, to put on plenty of water. You wash me yourselves. I don't want strange—" "Natalia, cross yourself, darling. What are you talking about death for? God is merciful. You'll get better." With a feeble gesture, Natalia asked her mother-in-law to be silent and said, "Don't interrupt me. It's already hard enough for me to talk, and I want to say, my head's swimming again. Have I told you about the water? But I must be strong. Kapitonovna did it quite early, as soon as I arrived after supper. She was terrified at what happened, poor woman. I lost an awful lot of blood. If only I can live till morning. Put on a lot of water. I want to be clean when I die. Mother, dress me in my green skirt, the one with the embroidery around the edges. Grishka liked me in that one. And my poplin jacket. It's in the chest at the top in the right-hand corner, just under a shawl. And when I die, they're to carry me to our people. You might send for Mother. Let her come at once. I must say goodbye to her. Get the sheet from under me. It's all wet." Raising Natalia with one arm behind her back, Ilinichna drew away the sheet and somehow managed to tuck another under her. With an effort, Natalia whispered, "Turn me over, on my side," and she lost consciousness. The dove-gray dawn peered in at the window. Dunya washed a bucket and went out into the yard to milk the cows. Ilinichna threw the window wide open, and the best room, heavy with the scent of fresh blood, the smell of burnt paraffin, was freshened with the sharp, cheering chill of the summer morning. The wind swept the teardrops of dew off the cherry leaves lying on the outside window ledge. The early voices of birds, the lowing of cows, the thick, spasmodic cracks of the shepherd's whip came through the window. Natalia came to, opened her eyes, licked her dry, bloodless, yellow lips with the end of her tongue, and asked for a drink. She no longer asked after the children or her mother. Everything was slipping away from her, and slipping away forever. Ilinichna closed the window and went across to the bed. How terribly Natalia had changed during this one night.
The previous day she had been like a young apple tree in blossom, beautiful, healthy, strong.
But now her cheeks were whiter than chalk from the Dawnside hills. Her nose was peaked. Her lips had lost their recent brilliant freshness, had grown thinner, and seemed to be shrinking back from her parted teeth. Only her eyes retained their former glitter, but their expression had changed. They had a new, strange, alarming look as from time to time, submitting to some inexplicable necessity, she raised her bluish lids and peered around the room, then rested her glance on Ilinichna for a second. Panteleimon returned at sunrise. The heavy-eyed doctor, weary with sleepless nights and endless bother with typhus and wounded cases, stretched himself and climbed out of the tarantass, took a bundle from the seat and went into the hut. On the steps he removed his canvas raincoat and, leaning over the handrail, spent a long time washing his hairy hands, looking up under his eyebrows at Dunya as she poured water from a jug into his palms, and even winking at her. Then he went into the best room and spent a good 10 minutes with Natalia, first sending out everybody else. Panteleimon and Ilinichna sat down in the kitchen. "Well, how is she?" the old man asked in a whisper as soon as they left the best room. "Bad. Did she do it of her own will?" "It was her own idea." Ilinichna evaded the question. "Hot water, quick!" the doctor ordered, thrusting his tousled head round the door. While the water was being heated, he came into the kitchen. At the old man's mute question, he waved his hand hopelessly. "She'll be gone by dinner time. She's lost a terrible quantity of blood. There's nothing to be done. Have you sent word to Grigory Pantelyevich?" Without answering, Panteleimon hurriedly limped out into the porch. Darya saw the old man go under the eaves of the shed to the mowing machine, lean his head against a pile of old dung-fuel bricks, and weep aloud. The doctor remained another half-hour and sat a little while on the steps, dozing under the rays of the rising sun. When the samovar began to boil, he went back into the best room, gave Natalia a camphor injection, then came out and asked for some milk. Stifling a yawn, he drank 2 glasses of milk and said, "Take me back at once. I've got sick and wounded waiting at Vyashenska, and there's nothing I can do here. It's quite hopeless. I'd do anything I could for Grigory Pantelyevich, but I tell you frankly I can do nothing. There's little enough we can do at the best of times. We can only heal the sick. We haven't yet learned how to resurrect the dead. And your little woman has been so badly cut about that she's got nothing left to live with. The womb's torn terribly. There's nothing of it left. I expect the old woman used an iron hook. It's our ignorance. You can't ever get away from it." Panteleimon threw hay into the tarantass and told Darya, "You drive him back. Don't forget to water the mare when you drop down to the Don." He was about to offer the doctor money, but the man flatly refused it, shaming the old man with, "You ought to be ashamed even to speak of it, Panteleimon Prokofyevich. My own people, and you're offering me money. No, don't come near me with it. How can you repay me? You needn't ask. If I could put your daughter-in-law on her feet, it would be a different matter." About 6 o'clock in the morning, Natalia felt considerably better. She asked for a wash, combed her hair before a mirror which Dunya held for her, and looking around at her dear ones, her eyes glittering, she forced a smile. "Well, now I'm on the mend, but I was really frightened. I thought I was done for. But why are the children sleeping so late? Dunya, go and see if they're awake yet." Her mother, Lukinichna, arrived with her younger sister, Agrippina. The old woman burst into tears when she saw her daughter, but Natalia said again and again in an agitated tone, "What are you crying for, Mother? I'm not so bad now. You haven't come to bury me, have you? Oh, do tell me, what are you crying for?" Agrippina gave her mother a nudge, and guessing the reason, Lukinichna swiftly wiped her eyes and said in a soothing tone, "Why, what are you thinking, child? I was crying just because I've such a stupid head. My heart ached as I looked at you. You've changed so much." A faint flush glowed in Natalia's cheeks when she heard Mishatka's voice and Polyushka's laugh. "Bring them in here. Call them quick," she asked. "They can dress after." Polyushka came in first and halted at the door, rubbing her sleepy eyes with her little fist. "Your mummy's fallen ill," Natalia said with a smile. "Come over to me, my treasure." Polyushka looked in surprise at the grown-ups sitting gravely on the benches, and going over to her mother, said in a vexed tone, "Why didn't you wake me up? And what have they all come for?" "They've come to see me. But why should I have woke you up? I'd have brought you some water and sat with you." "Well, go and wash, comb your hair and say your prayers, and then you can come and sit with me." "But will you be getting up for breakfast?" "I don't know. I don't think so." "Well, then I'll bring your breakfast in here. Would you like that, Mummy?" "She's the very image of her father, only her heart's not like his. Hers is softer," Natalia said with a feeble smile, letting her head fall back and pulling the blanket around her legs as though she were cold.
An hour later she took a turn for the worse. She beckoned the children to her, embraced them, signed the cross over them, kissed them, and asked her mother to take them to her. Lukinichna entrusted the children to Agrippina and remained with her daughter. Natalia closed her eyes and said as though delirious, "I can't see him like that." Then, as though she had remembered something, she sharply raised herself on the bed and asked, "Bring Mishatka back." The tear-stained Agrippina pushed the boy into the room and remained quietly moaning in the kitchen. Sullen, with the Melyukovs' ungracious look, Mishatka timidly came into the room. The sharp change which had occurred in his mother's face made her almost a stranger, unrecognizable. Natalia drew her son towards her and felt his heart fluttering swiftly, like that of a trapped sparrow. "Bend down to me, little son. Closer," she asked. She whispered something into his ear, then pushed him away, questioningly gazed into his eyes, compressed her quivering lips, and forcing a miserable, tormented smile, asked him, "You won't forget? You'll tell him?" "I shan't forget." Mishatka clutched his mother's forefinger, squeezed it in his hot little fist, held it tightly for a second, then let it go. As he stepped away from the bed, for some reason he walked on tiptoe, balancing himself with his arms. Natalia watched him to the door, then silently turned to the wall. She died at noon. Chapter 7. Innumerable were Gregor's thoughts and memories during the 2 days' journey from the front to his native village. Afraid to remain alone in the steppe with his grief, with his importunate thoughts of Natalia, he took Prokhorezhikov with him. As soon as they were clear of the village in which his squadron was quartered, Gregor turned to talking of the war, recalling how he had served in the 12th Regiment on the Austrian front, how they had marched into Romania, how they had fought the Germans. He talked on and on without stopping, recalling all kinds of absurd incidents in which their comrades of the regiment had been involved, and laughing. At first, amazed at Gregor's unusual garrulity, the simple-minded Prokhor took astonished sidelong glances at him, but then he guessed that Gregor was trying to find relief from his oppressive thoughts in these memories of past days, and helped to keep the conversation going with perhaps unnecessary effort. As he was telling of the time he had spent in Chernigov Hospital, Prokhor happened to glance at Gregor and saw the tears streaming down his swarthy cheeks. Prokhor respectfully dropped back a few yards and rode behind for half an hour. Then he again drew level and tried to talk about some casual, insignificant matter, but Gregor did not take up the conversation. So they trotted along until noonday in silence, side by side, stirrup to stirrup. The Dawn Flows Home to the Sea, Part 2, by Mikhail Sholokhov, continued. So they trotted along until noonday in silence, side by side, stirrup to stirrup. Gregor hurried along desperately. Despite the heat, he kept his horse at a sharp trot, then broke into a gallop, and only occasionally slowed him down into a walking pace. He did not call a halt until noon, when the vertical rays of the sun began to burn intolerably. Then he stopped in a ravine and unsaddled his horse, turning him loose to graze. He went off into the shade, stretched himself face downward, and lay so until the heat began to abate. They gave the horses a feed of oats, but Gregor did not observe the proper feeding time. By the end of the first day, their horses, accustomed though they were to long marches, had deeply sunken flanks, and they no longer moved with the unwearying spirit of the morning. "It's stupid to spoil the horses," Prokhor thought irritably. "Whoever rides like this? It's all very well for him, the devil. He's forcing his own animal along, and he can get himself another at any moment.
But where could I get a mount? He'll gallop the horses to death, and then we'll have to go on foot all the rest of the way to Tatarsk, or else drag along on a requisitioned wagon." Next morning he could keep silent no longer, and at last he said to Gregor, "Anyone would think you'd never owned your own horse. Whoever would gallop like this day and night without a rest? Look how the horses are worn out. Let's give them a proper feed when evening comes, at any rate." "Keep up. Don't lag behind," Gregor answered absent-mindedly. "I can't keep up with you. My horse is dead beat. Couldn't we have a rest?" Gregor did not answer. For half an hour they trotted along without exchanging a word. Then Prokhor resolutely announced, "Let's give them a breather at least. I'm not going to ride on any further like this, do you hear? Whip him up. Whip him up." "But how long are we to go on whipping him up, until he loses his hoofs?" "Don't argue." "Have pity, Gregor Pantelyevich. I don't want to flay my horse, but things are coming to such a pass." "Well, then halt and damn you. Look for a spot with good grass." The telegram had been wandering in search of Gregor through all the districts of the Khopyersk region, and it arrived too late. He reached home on the third day after Natalia was buried. He dismounted at the wicket gate. Dunya ran out of the house and burst into sobs. He put his arm around her as he strode along, and asked, knitting his brows, "Give the horse a good long walk. Now don't bellow." Turning to Prokhor, he ordered, "Ride home. If you're wanted, I'll let you know." Holding Mishatka and Polyushka by the hands, Ilinichna came out onto the steps to welcome her son. Gregor snatched up the children in his arms and said in a quivering voice, "Now, don't cry. Now, no tears, my darlings. So you're left motherless. Now, your mummy's done us an ill turn." But he himself had difficulty in choking back his sobs as he went into the hut and greeted his father. "We couldn't keep," Pantelyevich said, and at once limped off into the porch. Ilinichna led Gregor into the best room and told him about Natalia. The old woman did not want to tell all the truth, but Gregor asked, "Why did she take it into her head not to have the child? Do you know?" "Yes, I do." "Well?" "She had called on the previous day, and Aksenia told her everything." So that's it." Gregor flushed heavily, and his eyes dropped. He came out looking older and pale. Soundlessly working his bluish quivering lips, he sat down at the table, fondled the children for some time, and seated them on his knees. Then he took out a piece of grayish, dusty sugar from his field pack, broke it on his palm with a knife, and guiltily smiled. "That's all I've been able to bring you. That's the sort of father you've got. Well, run into the yard and call your granddad." "Will you visit the grave?" Ilinichna asked him. "Later, when I can get the chance. The dead never take offense." "How are Mishatka and Polyushka? Are they all right?" "They cried a lot the first day, especially Polyushka. But now it's just as though they'd come to some agreement, and they never talk about her in front of us. But last night I heard Mishatka quietly crying. He'd put his head under the pillow so as not to be heard. I went to him and asked, 'What's the matter, darling? Would you like to come and lie with me?' But he says, 'It's all right, Granny. I must have been crying in my sleep.' You talk to them. Have pity on them. Yesterday morning I heard them talking to each other in the porch. Polyushka was saying, 'She'll come back to us. She's young, and the young don't die.' They're still foolish, but their little hearts ache as though they were grown up. I expect you're hungry. Sit down and I'll get something ready for you. What are you sitting dumb for?" Gregor went into the best room. He behaved as though he had found his way there for the first time in his life. He looked attentively around the walls and rested his gaze on the bed. It had been made, and its pillows were puffed up. On that bed Natalia had died. From that bed her voice had sounded for the last time. He imagined her saying goodbye to the children, kissing them, and perhaps signing the cross over them. And once more, as at the moment when he had read the telegram telling of her death, he felt a sharp, stabbing pain in his heart, a muffled ringing in his ears. Every little thing in the house reminded him of Natalia. His memories of her were indestructible and tormenting. For some reason he went from room to room, visiting them all, then hurriedly went out, almost ran onto the steps. The pain in his heart seared more and more. A sweat beaded his brow. Fearfully pressing his palm against his left breast, he went down the steps thinking, "This old grey nag has galloped up a steep hill or two." Dunya was walking his horse about the yard. By the granary the horse resisted the rain and halted to snuff at the earth, stretching out its neck and rolling back its upper lip, laying bare the yellow plates of its teeth. Then it snorted and awkwardly bent its hind legs. Dunya pulled on the rein, but the animal paid no attention and began to lie down. "Don't let him roll over," Panteleimon shouted from the stable. "Can't you see he's saddled? Why didn't you unsaddle him, you devilish little fool?" Unhurriedly, still listening to the thumping in his chest, Gregor went up to the horse, removed the saddle, and forced a smile as he said to Dunya, "Father still shouting?" "As usual," Dunya said with an answering smile. "Lead him about a little longer, sister. He's quite dry now, but I will if you want me to. Let him have a roll if he likes. Don't stop him. Now, brother. Grieving?" "And why shouldn't I?" Gregor answered with a sigh. Moved by a feeling of compassion, Dunya kissed him on the shoulder, and upset to the point of tears, she swiftly turned and led the horse to the cattle yard. Gregor went across to his father, who was diligently raking dung out of the stable. "I'm getting the place ready for your charger," the old man said. "Why didn't you tell me? I'd have cleaned it out myself." "A fine idea. Why, am I helpless? My boy, I'm like a flintlock. There's no wearing me out. I can still hop around a bit. Tomorrow I'm thinking of going out to sow the rye. Are you staying for long?" "A month." "Now that's fine. Shall we drive out to the fields? You'll find it easier if you're working." "I'd already thought of that myself." The old man threw down the pitchfork, wiped the sweat from his face with his sleeve, and said in a mysterious tone, "Let's go into the hut, and you have some dinner. You can never get away from it. Sorrow, I mean. You can't run away from it, and you can't bury yourself from it. That's how it is." Ilinichna laid the table and gave Gregor a clean hand-towel. And yet again Gregor recalled, "In the old days Natalia waited on me." To hide his feelings, he attacked the food vigorously. He gave his father a grateful look when the old man brought a ewer of homemade vodka, its neck closed by a bunch of hay from the cellar. "We'll drink in memory of the dead, may she rest in God," Panteleimon said in a firm tone. They each drank a glass. Without waiting, the old man filled the glasses again and sighed, "2 of the family gone in 1 year. Death's taken a fancy to our hut." "Don't let's talk about that, Father," Gregor asked. He drank his second glass at one gulp, chewed long at a piece of dried fish, and waited for the drink to go to his head, to stifle his importunate thoughts. "The rye is fine this year, and our sowings are far better than anybody else's," Panteleimon said boastfully. In that very boastfulness, in the very tone of his father's voice, Gregor detected a forced and studied note. "But how about the wheat?" "The wheat? It's been nipped a bit with the frost, but it's not too bad. It'll be a middling harvest. But the hard wheat, others have done well with that, but as luck would have it, we didn't happen to sow any. I don't mind overmuch. With such destruction all around, what can you do with grain? You can't sell it, and you can't keep it in the bins. When the front comes back this way, the comrades will carry it all off. They'll lick it up. But don't you worry. Even without this year's harvest, we've got grain enough for a couple of years. Praise be, we've got our bins full to the lids, and some more elsewhere." The old man winked craftily and said, "You ask Daria how much we've buried against a rainy day. The hole's your height deep and half as wide again as your arms outstretched, and we filled it to the edge. This accursed life has made us poor, but after all, we've managed to look after ourselves, too." The old man laughed drunkenly, but after a moment he stroked his beard with dignity and said in a serious business-like tone, "Maybe you're thinking about your mother-in-law, so I tell you I haven't forgotten her, and I've helped them in their need. Before she had time to say a word, I'd filled a wagon with grain, not stopping to measure it, and took it to her. Your dead Natalia was very pleased. She cried when she heard about it. Shall we put away a third glass, son? You're the only joy left to me now." "All right. Pour it out," Griagor assented, pushing his glass across the table. At that moment Mishatka came up timidly, edging his way to the table. He climbed onto his father's knee and, awkwardly putting his left arm around Griagor's neck, gave him a hearty kiss on the lips. "What's that for, little son?" Griagor asked, deeply moved. He looked into the child's tear-filled eyes and tried to avoid breathing vodka fumes into his son's face. Mishatka answered in a low voice, "When Mummy was lying in the best room, when she was still alive, she called me to her and told me, 'When your father comes, kiss him for me, and tell him to have pity on you.' She said something else, too, but I've forgotten." Griagor set down his glass and turned away to the window. There was a long, oppressive silence in the room. "Shall we drink up?" Panteleimon asked in a low tone. "I don't want any more." Griagor lifted his son down from his knee, rose, and hurriedly made for the porch. "Wait a bit, son. How about your meat? We've got boiled chicken and pancakes." Ilinichna rushed to the stove, but Griagor had already slammed the door behind him. Aimlessly wandering, he looked at the cattle yard, the stable. When he saw his horse, he thought, "I ought to take him for a bath." He went under the eaves of the shed. By the harvester, standing ready for mowing, he saw pine chips, shavings, and a piece of crooked board lying on the ground. Father made the coffin for Natalia, he decided, and hurriedly strode back to the steps of the house. Yielding to his son's demand, Panteleimon hastily made ready, harnessed the horses into the harvester, and loaded a small keg of water onto the platform. He and Griagor drove out to the fields that night. Griagor suffered, not only because he loved Natalia in his way, and had grown used to her during the 6 years they had lived together, but also because he felt responsible for her death. If Natalia had acted on her threat to take the children and go to live with her mother, if she had died there, hating her faithless husband and unreconciled with him, maybe Griagor would not have felt the burden of his loss so deeply, and doubtless he would not have been so painfully racked with remorse. But his mother told him Natalia had forgiven him everything, and that she had loved him and spoken of him until her last moment. And the knowledge, added to his suffering, burdened his conscience with incessant reproach, forced him to see the past years and all his conduct in a new light. There had been a time when he felt nothing but cold indifference and even hostility to his wife, but of recent years he had come to feel very differently towards her. The children had been chiefly responsible for changing his attitude toward her. Griagor had not always felt that profound fatherly feeling for them which developed in later years. When he came home from the front for short periods of leave, he caressed and fondled them, almost from a sense of duty, and to please their mother. But he could not even watch Natalia and her violent demonstrations of maternal feeling without a sense of distrustful amazement. He did not understand how anyone could love those tiny, noisy creatures so self-forgetfully, and more than once while Natalia was still breastfeeding them, he told her at night with chagrin and a sneer in his tone, "What makes you jump up like that as though mad? You're on your feet before they've had time to cry. Let them kick and shout a bit. I don't suppose they'll cry tears of gold." The children were no less indifferent to him, but as they grew older, their attachment to their father grew also. Their love aroused a response in him, and his feeling for them was extended to their mother. After the break with Aksenia, Griagor had never seriously thought of leaving his wife. Never, not even when they came together again, had he thought of Aksenia as taking the place of the mother of his children.
He was not unready to live with them both, loving each of them in his own way. But now he had lost his wife, he abruptly felt alienated from Aksenia, and was suddenly filled with mute anger against her for having betrayed their relations and so driven Natalia to her death. Try as he would to forget his sorrow, as he worked in the fields, he inevitably returned to it in thought. He wore himself out with work. He did not climb out of the harvester seat for hours, yet he still recalled Natalia. His memory persistently resurrected various long-past, frequently insignificant incidents of their life together, their talks together. He had but to remove the bridle from his willing memory for a moment, and the living, smiling Natalia would arise before him once more. He recalled her figure, her walk, her way of tidying her hair, her smile, the intonation of her voice. On the third day they began to harvest the barley. At midday, when Panteleimon halted the horses, Griagor climbed down from the harvester seat, laid the short pitchfork on the floorboards, and said, "I want to go home for an hour or so, Father." "What for?" "I just want to see the children." "All right, off with you," the old man willingly agreed, "and meantime we'll be doing some stacking." Griagor at once unharnessed his horse from the harvester, mounted it, and rode at a walking pace over the yellow, brushy stubble towards the high road. "Tell him to have pity on you," Natalia's voice sounded in his ears. He closed his eyes, dropped the rein, and, lost in memories, let the horse take its own way. In the deeply azure heaven, rare wind-scattered clouds hung almost motionless. Rooks were hopping with half-spread wings over the stubble. They settled in flocks on the stacks. Beak to beak the old ones fed the young, newly fledged birds, which still rose uncertainly on the wing. Over the harvested acres, the rooks croaking blended into a steady groan. Griagor's horse tried to pick its way along the side of the road, occasionally tearing up and chewing clumps of clover as it went. Its bit clattered as it hung loose. Twice, seeing horses in the distance, it came to a halt and neighed, and then Griagor roused himself and urged the animal on, while with unseeing eyes he gazed over the steppe, the dusty road, the yellow sprinkle of stacks, the greenish-brown plots of ripened millet. As soon as Griagor reached home, the glum-looking Christonia put in an appearance. Despite the heat, he was dressed in an English cloth tunic and broad riding breeches. He walked in, leaning on an enormous, freshly trimmed ash stick, and greeted Griagor. "I've dropped in to see you. I heard about your trouble. So they've buried Natalia Mironovna." "How did you get back from the front?" Griagor asked, pretending not to hear Christonia's question, satisfiedly examining his awkwardly built, slightly bowed figure. "They sent me home to get better after a wound. I had 2 bullets at once score me across the belly, and they're still stuck there by my entrails, it looks like, damn them, and that's why I'm using a stick, you see." "Where did they make that mess of you?" "Close to Balashov." "Did we capture it?" "And how did you get your packet?" "We were making an attack, and I think Balashov was taken." "Well, tell me what regiment you're with, and who else of the village is with you. Sit down. Have a smoke." Griagor was delighted to see a fresh face, to have an opportunity to talk with someone outside the family who had had nothing to do with his suffering. Christonia revealed some understanding and guessed that Griagor did not want his sympathy. He willingly but slowly began to tell how Balashov was captured and how he got his wound. Smoking an enormous cigarette, he said in his thick, deep voice, "We were advancing on foot through sunflowers. The Reds were firing from machine guns, and of course from rifles, too. That goes without saying. I'm easily picked out among the others. I'm like a goose among chickens. No matter how low I bend, all of me can be seen. Well, and they, the bullets I mean, found me. For that matter, it's a good job I was moving at full height, for if I'd been bending, they'd have caught me right in the head. It appears they were spent bullets, but the moment they struck me, everything in my belly began to grumble.
And they were both so hot, damn them, you'd have said they'd flown straight out of a stove. I clapped my hand to the spot, and I could feel them inside me, rolling about under the skin like a couple of tumors, one close to the other. Well, I felt at them with my fingers, and then dropped, it seems. I thought, this is a poor joke. To hell with such jokes. Better keep still, or another might come flying, sharper than the others, and go right through me. Well, so I lay there, and I felt them, the bullets, I mean. They were still there, one close to the other. I got alarmed, for I thought they might make their way into my belly, and then what? They'd go rolling about among my intestines, and then how would the doctors ever find them? And besides, they wouldn't be any pleasure to me. A man's body, even mine, is fluid. The bullets would go wandering into my bowels, and then I'd go walking about rattling like a post bell. It would break me up completely. I lay and twisted off a head of sunflower and ate the seeds, but I was frightened all the same. Our line had gone on. Well, and when Balashov was taken, I was ordered there too. Then I lay in the field hospital at Tishanka. The doctor there was as cocky as a sparrow. He kept asking me, "Shall we cut out the bullets?" But I lay thinking it over. I asked him, "Your Excellency, can they get lost in my inside?" "No," he said, "they can't." Well, then I thought, I'm not going to let them be cut out. I know that game. They'd cut them out, and before the wound had had time to heal, I'd be sent back to my regiment. "No," I said, "Your Excellency, I won't have them cut out. It's even more interesting for me with them inside. I'd like to carry them home to show my wife, and they're no bother to me. They're not a great weight." He swore at me good and hard, but he let me go home on sick leave for a week. Griagor smiled as he listened to the artless story, and asked, "What regiment have you got into?" "The 4th. "Who else from the village is with you?" "Quite a lot. Anikushka, Beshlebnikov, Achim Kolovyedin, Siemka Miroshnikov, Tikhon Gorbachev." "Well, and how are the Cossacks? Not complaining?" "They're upset with the officers, it looks like. They've put such filthy swine over us, there's no living with them. And they're almost all Russian. There isn't a Cossack among them." As he spoke, Christonia pulled down the short sleeve of his tunic and examined and stroked the excellent cloth of his English breeches, as though he could hardly believe that he was wearing such good material. "But you know, I couldn't find boots to fit my feet," he said meditatively. "The people who live in the English country haven't got such healthy legs. We sow and eat wheat, but I expect in England it's like in Russia. They only have rye to eat. Otherwise, how could they have such small feet? They've clothed and shod all our company and sent us scented cigarettes, but all the same, things are bad." "What's bad?" Griagor asked with interest. "It seems all right outside, but inside it's bad. You know, the Cossacks are again wanting to get out of fighting. So nothing will come of this war. They were saying they wouldn't go farther than the Hopyevsk region." When he had said goodbye to Christonia, after a moment's reflection, Griagor decided, "I'll stay here a week, and then go back to the front. I shall die of misery here." He remained at home until evening. He remembered the days of his childhood, and made Mishatka a windmill of reeds, fashioned a sparrow snare from a horsehair, expertly made his daughter a tiny carriage with wheels that turned, and a center pole painted in extraordinary colors, and even tried to make a doll out of rags. But nothing came of that. Dunya had to help to finish the doll. At first the children, to whom Griagor had never been so attentive before, were distrustful of his intentions, but afterwards they would not leave him for a minute, and late in the afternoon, when Griagor was making ready to ride back to the fields, Mishatka declared with tears in his voice, "You're always like that. No sooner are you here than you leave us again. Take your snare and the mill and the rattle with you. Take them all. I don't want them." Griagor took his son's little hands in his own great fists and said, "If that's how you feel, let's settle it this way. You're a Cossack, and you'll ride out with me to the fields. We'll mow the barley, and we'll stack it. You'll sit with grandfather on the harvester. You'll drive the horses. And the grasshoppers you'll find out there in the grass. The birds you'll see in the ravines. But Polyushka will stay at home with grandmother. She won't mind. She's a girl, and it's her job to sweep the floors, to bring grandmother water from the dawn in a little pail, and to do all sorts of women's tasks. Agreed?" "Oh, yes!" Mishatka exclaimed rapturously, and his eyes glittered at the prospect. "Where are you taking him to?" Ilinichna tried to object. "I don't know what you're thinking of. Where's he going to sleep? And who's going to look after him out there? God help us, he'll go too close to the horses and get kicked, or else a snake'll bite him. Don't go with your father, darling. You stay at home." She turned to her grandson. But Mishatka's narrowed eyes suddenly blazed ominously, exactly like his grandfather's when the old man was losing his temper. He clenched his little fists and shouted in a high-pitched, weeping tone, "Grandmother, shut up! I'm going, whatever happens." With a laugh, Gregor took his son by the hand and reassured Ilinichna. "He'll sleep with me. We'll ride back at a walking pace. I shan't let him fall. Get his clothes ready, Mother, and don't be afraid. I'll see he's safe and sound, and I'll bring him back whole tomorrow evening." And thus Gregor and Mishatka struck up a friendship. During the 3 weeks he spent in Tatarsk, Gregor saw Aksiniya only 3 times, and then he had only glimpses of her. With her native sense and tact, she avoided a meeting, realizing that it would be better for her not to come within his sight. Womanlike, she realized his mood, realized that any incautious and untimely demonstration of her feelings for him might set him against her and throw a cloud over their relations. She waited for Gregor himself to speak to her. The moment came a day before his departure for the front. He was driving back late from the fields with a wagon-load of grain, and in the dusk he met Aksiniya by the lane nearest to the steppe. She bowed, when still some distance away, and faintly smiled. Her smile was challenging and anxious. He answered her bow, but could not pass her by in silence. "How are you getting on?" he asked, imperceptibly pulling on the reins, slowing the horses down from their fast walking pace. "Quite well, thank you, Gregor Panteleyevich." "How is it we haven't seen anything of you?" "I've been out in the fields. I'm struggling with the work single-handed." Mishatka was sitting with Gregor in the wagon. Possibly for that reason, Gregor did not halt the horses, and did not stop for further conversation. He had driven on several yards when, hearing a call, he turned. Aksiniya was standing by the fence. "Are you staying long in the village?" she asked, agitatedly plucking the petals of a daisy. "I'm off any day now." By the way she hesitated for a second, it was evident that she wanted to ask something more. For some reason she did not, but waved her hand and hurriedly walked on into the common land, not once looking back. Chapter 8. The sky was overcast with clouds. A rain so fine that it seemed to have been sieved was sprinkling down. The young aftermath, the scrub, and the bushes of wild thorn scattered about the steppe were gleaming with rain. Highly indignant at his premature departure from the village, Prokhor rode along in silence and hardly spoke to Gregor all the way back to the regiment. Beyond a certain hamlet, they fell in with 3 mounted Cossacks. The men were riding in a row, urging their horses on with their heels, talking energetically among themselves. One of them, elderly and red-haired, dressed in a peasant's gray homespun coat, recognized Gregor and said in a loud voice to his companions, "But that's Melyukhov brothers." As they drew level with Gregor, he reined in his high-standing bay horse. "Our greetings to you, Gregor Panteleyevich," he cried. "Greetings," Gregor answered, vainly trying to recall where he had met this red-bearded, sullen-looking Cossack before. Evidently the man had only recently been raised to the rank of ensign, and in order not to be taken for a rank-and-file Cossack, he had sewn his new epaulets on his greatcoat. "Don't you know me?" he asked, riding right up to Gregor, stretching out his hand, and breathing the smell of vodka fumes into Gregor's face. An idiotic self-satisfaction beamed on the face of this newly cooked ensign.
His small blue eyes sparkled, and his lips twisted into a grin beneath his red mustache. Gregor was amused by the absurd appearance of this officer in a peasant's coat. Not attempting to hide his smile, he answered, "No, I don't. I must have met you when you were still a rank-and-file Cossack. Have you been made an ensign recently? You've hit the mark. It's just a week since they raised me to my present rank, but we met at one of Kudinov's staff meetings. Close to Blagoveshchenya, I think. You saved me from a little bit of trouble then, do you remember? Hey, Trifon, ride on slowly, and I'll catch up with you," he shouted to the other Cossacks, who had halted a little way off. After some difficulty, Gregor recalled his previous meeting with the red-haired ensign, and Kudinov's comment on him. He never misses when he fires. He can shoot hares in flight with his rifle. He's a devil in a fight, a good scout, but a babe in intelligence. The man had commanded a company during the rising, and had made some blunder. Kudinov had wanted to deal sternly with him, but Gregor had intervened, and he had been pardoned and left with the rank of company commander. "Come from the front?" Gregor asked. "Yes, I'm going on furlough from Novopolsk. I've ridden 100 miles out of my way to call on kinsmen of mine. I've got a good memory, Gregor Pantelyevich. Don't refuse me the pleasure of treating you. I've got a couple of bottles of 100% liquor in my pack. Let's open them on the spot, shall we?" Gregor flatly refused, but he accepted the bottle the man offered him as a present. "You should have been there. Cossacks and officers were loaded down with goods," the ensign boastfully declared. "I was in Balashov, too. We captured the place and made straight for the railway, where we found 3 full trainloads standing. All the tracks were crowded with freight cars. One car was full of sugar, a second full of uniforms, and a third had all sorts of things in it. Some of the Cossacks carried off up to 40 sets of clothing. And afterwards, when we went to shake up the Jews, you'd have laughed. In my half-company, one clever Jew-catcher collected 18 watches, 10 of them gold. He hung them all over his chest, just as though he was the richest merchant in the land. And the rings and bracelets he'd got, you couldn't have counted them. He had 2 or 3 on each finger." Gregor pointed to the man's swollen saddlebags and asked, "And what's that you've got there?" "Why, all sorts of things." "So you went looting, too?" "Well, call it that if you like, but we didn't loot. We won it legally. Our regimental commander said take the town, and it's at your disposal for 2 days. And am I any worse than the others? I took legal stuff, whatever came to my hand. Others did much worse." "Fine fighters." Gregor gazed at the ensign in disgust and added, "The likes of you lurk under the bridges on the high roads, but you don't fight. You've turned the war into a looting expedition. Ah, you scum! You've got a new trade. But don't you think that someday or other you and your commander, too, will be flayed alive for this?" "For what?" "For all that." "But who's going to do the flaying?" "A superior officer." The man smiled sarcastically and said, "But they're all the same. We only take stuff in our saddlebags or our wagons, but they're sending away whole trainloads of baggage." "Why, have you seen them?" "Have I seen them? I myself convoyed one such baggage train to Yarizhenka. There was a whole wagon-load of silver dishes, cups, and spoons. Some of the officers flew at us with, 'What have you got there? Here, show us.' But when I said it was the personal property of General so-and-so, they went off empty-handed." "Who is this general?" Gregor asked, narrowing his eyes and nervously fiddling with the reins. The man smiled craftily and answered, "I've forgotten his name. What is it? God help me to remember. No, it's gone. I can't recall it. But there's no point in your swearing, Gregor Pantelyevich. God's truth, everybody's doing it. Compared to the others, I'm like a lamb to wolves. I took very little, but others stripped people naked in the very middle of the street and raped the Jew girls wherever they came upon them. I didn't go in for such things. I've got my own lawful wife, and what a wife. She's a stallion, not a woman. No, you've got no cause to be angry with me. Wait a bit, where are you off to?" Gregor coldly nodded in farewell to the man and put his horse into a trot, saying to Prokhor, "Keep up behind me." On the road, they met more and more Cossacks riding off on furlough in ones and twos and in groups. Quite often they passed wagons drawn by a pair of horses, with their loads covered by tarpaulins or blankets carefully tied down. Cossacks in new summer tunics and Red Army khaki trousers trotted, standing in their stirrups behind the wagons. Their dusty, sunburnt faces were animated and cheerful. But when they saw Gregor, they hurried past as quickly as possible, riding in silence, raising their hands to the visors of their caps as though at a command, and fell to talking again only when they had put a respectable distance between themselves and Gregor. "Merchants on the move," Prokhor jested when in the distance he saw horsemen convoying a wagon loaded with plunder. But not all the men they met going on furlough were weighed down with loot. Halting to water the horses at a well in one of the villages, Gregor heard singing coming from the next yard. Judging by the youthfully clear, fine voices, it was a group of young Cossacks singing. "Giving a farewell party to a soldier, I should say," Prokhor said as he drew up a pail of water. The bottle of liquor they had drunk the evening before had put him in the mood for a carousal, and so, hurriedly watering the horses, he suggested with a laugh, "What do you think, Pantelievich? Shall we go and join them? Maybe a stirrup cup will fall to our lot, too. The hut's got a reed thatch, but you can tell they're rich." Gregor agreed to go and see how the young Cossack was being speeded on his way. Tying the horses to the fence, he and Prokhor went into the yard. 4 saddled horses were standing by circular mangers under the eaves of a shed. A lad with an iron measure filled to the brim with oats came out of the granary. He glanced at Gregor and went to the whinnying horses. A song came floating round the corner of the hut. A high, vibrating tenor was singing. As along the path they went, not a man on foot. A thick, smoky bass voice repeated the last words and blended with the tenor. Then further voices joined in harmony, and the song flowed on majestically, expansively, and mournfully. Gregor did not want to interrupt the singers, so he touched Prokhor's sleeve and whispered, "Wait a bit. Don't let them see you. Let them finish." "It isn't a send-off. The Yalanska Cossacks always sing like that." "But they can sing, the devils," Prokhor remarked approvingly and spat with annoyance. It looked as though his expectations of a drink would go unrealized. The pleasant tenor told to the end the story of the Cossack who made a mistake during a war. Nor foot nor horse's trace was to be seen. The Cossack regiment marched along the road. Behind the regiment ran a spirited horse. A Circassian saddle had slipped to his side, and the bridle hung over his right ear. The silken reins were tangled in his feet. Behind him ran a youthful Don Cossack, and to his faithful steed he shouted loud, "Stop, wait a bit, my spirited faithful horse. Do not abandon me, for without you never shall I escape from the wicked Chechens." Entranced by the singing, Gregor stood leaning against the whitewashed base of the hut, hearing neither the horses neighing nor the creak of wagons passing along the street. When the song ended, one of the singers coughed and said, "We didn't sing like that when we were taken up. Never mind, we do our best. But you ought to give the soldiers something more for the road, women. We've eaten well, Christ be thanked, but we haven't got a bite or sup to take with us for the road." Gregor roused himself from his reverie and walked round the corner. 4 young Cossacks were sitting on the bottom step below the door. Women and children who had come running from the neighboring huts surrounded them in a dense crowd. Sobbing and snuffling, the audience wiped away their tears with the ends of their kerchiefs. As Gregor went up to the steps, one old woman, tall and black-eyed, with the traces of a stern, icon-like beauty on her withered face, was saying in a slow drawl, "My dears, how beautifully and how sorrowfully you sing. And I expect every one of you has got a mother, and I expect when she thinks of her son and how he's perishing in the war, she streams with tears." Flashing the yellow whites of her eyes at Gregor as he greeted the crowd, she suddenly said angrily, "And you, Your Excellency, are you leading such flowers to their death? You're causing them to perish in the war." "We're perishing ourselves, old woman," Gregor answered moodily. Discountenanced by the arrival of a strange officer, the Cossacks nimbly jumped up. With their feet they pushed aside the plates with remnants of food on the steps and tidied their tunics, rifle straps, and belts. They had been singing without even removing the rifles from their shoulders. The very oldest of them did not appear to be more than 25 years. "Where are you from?" Grigory asked, running his eyes over the men's fresh, youthful faces. "From a regiment," a snub-nosed youngster with humorous eyes answered irresolutely. "I mean, where were you born? What is your native district? You're not local men, are you?" "We're Yalanska men. We're going on furlough, Your Excellency." Grigory recognized the solo singer by his voice and smiled as he asked, "You were the soloist, weren't you?" "Yes." "Well, you've got a fine voice. But what were you singing for? For joy? You don't look to be drunk." A tall, fair youngster with a dashing, dusty forelock, a deep flush on his swarthy cheeks, glanced sidelong at the old woman, and reluctantly answered with an embarrassed smile, "What joy do you think we've got? Need is what makes us sing. Life isn't too good in these parts. They don't feed you too well. Just a hunk of bread, and that's all. And so we hit upon the idea of singing. As soon as we start, all the women come running to listen. We strike up some sad song, and they're touched and bring a piece of fat, or a pipkin of milk, or something else that's good to eat. We're sort of priests, Captain. We sing and collect alms," said the soloist, winking at his comrades. His humorous eyes narrowed in a smile. One of the Cossacks took a greasy paper out of his breast pocket and held it out to Grigory, saying, "Here's our furlough paper." This book is continued on cassette number 4, side 1.